A Bitcoin transfer moved across the network at the exact second a man took his final breath. Not 1 second after, not 1 second before. The timestamp matched his death to the millisecond. A transaction from a wallet that had been silent for 12 years. A wallet with no activity, no movement, no reason to pulse back to life. Yet it awakened at the very instant his heart stopped. Imagine the impossibility. A digital action occurring in perfect sync with a physical ending. A machine speaking in the same moment the body it belonged to went still. No alerts triggered the system. No script executed. No automation existed on that wallet. And yet, a transfer slipped into the chain like a whisper woven through stone. You may think coincidences happen every day, but this was not a coincidence. The network registered it in real time, and a cluster of nodes flagged the event for inspection, unaware that something far deeper had taken place. The transfer originated from coordinates matching a place not connected to any device at that hour. A place locked, dark, and abandoned. For 12 years, the wallet slept in absolute silence, untouched by human hands. So how did it awaken at the last moment of his life? More importantly, why did it choose that single second to speak? There are stories that unfold like gentle waves. This is not one of them. This story rises like a dark tide that drags everything toward a point you cannot see, until you are already beneath the surface. And once you understand what happened on the night he died, you may never view digital traces the same way again. Because some patterns are too precise to be natural. Some events align so perfectly that the only possible explanation is the one no one wants to accept. Before we begin the descent into what truly happened, you need to stay close. This story asks you to pay attention to details that hide in quiet corners of the digital world. If you want to explore more stories that slip between technology and the unknown, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a single unraveling. Like this video because it helps these investigations travel farther. And comment your country and your city so I can see the reach of these narratives across the world. Now we return to the man whose life ended the very moment the transfer occurred. His name was Ethan. He was a man who lived with the kind of silence that grows heavier with every year. Some people fear noise. Ethan feared the absence of it. He worked from home analyzing blockchain structures for private firms, spending long nights in front of monitors that glowed like artificial moons. His life had narrowed into a routine of numbers, patterns, and screens that moved faster than any person could. He found comfort in the predictable symmetry of digital systems. People were harder to understand. Ethan rarely left his apartment except for necessities. The quiet suited him, or at least he convinced himself it did. But even silence has a weight, and his had begun to feel like a shadow leaning over his shoulder. On the night he died, he was alone in his apartment, surrounded by machines that hummed softly. And at that exact instant, somewhere in the darkness of the blockchain, a dormant wallet released a fragment of truth no one was prepared to witness. Ethan had first encountered the silent wallet 12 years earlier, during a routine sweep of inactive addresses. Back then it had seemed unremarkable, another relic buried beneath countless layers of data. It contained a small balance, untouched since its creation. No transfers, no signatures, no activity. Yet something about it lingered in his thoughts. The address felt incomplete, as though a missing piece of meaning waited beneath the surface. The logic of it resisted explanation. He bookmarked it, thinking he might revisit it someday. But years passed without any reason to do so. The wallet remained still, frozen in time. As Ethan withdrew from the noise of the world, the quiet address faded into the background with the rest of his life. On the night of his death, the cold glow of his monitor illuminated the room with a soft blue haze. He sat alone at his desk with a sense of heaviness in his chest, a weight that felt older than any illness. His breath slowed, his vision blurred. He leaned back, feeling his heartbeat stutter in a rhythm that no longer obeyed him. And somewhere inside the digital ocean he had studied for years, the silent wallet stirred. A transfer initiated. A signal pulsed. A message moved. And the moment Ethan's body went still, the blockchain recorded the first heartbeat the wallet had ever expressed. It was the beginning of a mystery that would unravel long after he was gone. The investigation into the transfer began quietly the next morning, long before anyone learned that Ethan had died. The blockade flagged the activity simply because the dormant wallet behaved unlike anything seen in years. At first it looked like a technical anomaly, a sudden movement from an address that should have remained silent, but the analysts who examined it felt something they could not name. They described it later as a shift in the air around the data, a sensation as though the numbers carried a pulse of their own. One analyst named Nora was the first to trace the origin of the transfer. She spent hours staring at the hexadecimal pattern, trying to find where the initiating signal came from. It pointed to a physical location, a specific coordinate that mapped perfectly to Ethan's apartment, yet no device inside that apartment had broadcast at the time of the transfer. The logs showed no outgoing connection. The routers registered no instability. The network recorded silence. And still, a message had moved. Nora leaned back in her chair and felt a cold ripple travel across her skin. She had seen unusual patterns before, but this one carried intent. The more she studied it, the more she sensed that the transfer had not emerged from a machine, but from a moment in time. She replayed the timestamp repeatedly, watching the millisecond alignment until it haunted her thoughts. At that exact moment, Ethan's life had ended, and something inside the dormant wallet awakened. Nora dug deeper into Ethan's history. She reviewed old logs, archived projects, and every analysis he had completed during his reclusive final years. She found no record of him interacting with the dormant wallet after the initial discovery, 12 years earlier. Yet she learned enough about him to understand his quiet world. Ethan lived inside his thoughts, moving through data the way others moved through crowded streets. He traced patterns in silence and found comfort in the certainty of numbers. But she also discovered gaps in his work, sections of projects abandoned without explanation. It looked as though he had lost interest in tasks that once fascinated him. The last months of his life revealed a decline, so subtle that no one noticed. Patterns he once identified with ease, he began missing. Details he once highlighted, he overlooked. Nora felt a heaviness settle over her as she scanned the archived records. She sensed that Ethan had been carrying a burden that had no shape or name. When she reached the night of his death, she saw something that made her pause. The last project he worked on involved revisiting clusters of inactive wallets, and among the list, highlighted without comment, sat the silent address that would later awaken. Nora returned to the transaction itself and examined the content with obsessive attention. The transfer amount was small, almost insignificant, but embedded inside the payload was a pattern she could not identify. It was not text. It was not a key. It was not any recognized structure. It resembled a fragment of data that had been shaped deliberately, a soft curve of numbers that repeated just slightly out of rhythm. Nora enlarged the pattern and felt the faintest tremor beneath her ribs. There was something emotional in the structure, not sentimental, but weighted, like a thought compressed into a form computers should not be able to carry. The pattern resembled a breath that had been captured and frozen. She had encountered data anomalies before, but none that felt like they were reaching toward her. As she stared at the formation, she realized something that deepened her unease. The curve inside the pattern matched the subtle rhythm of Ethan's heart rate recorded during his last medical appointment. It was an exact echo of the rise and fall of a living pulse that no longer existed. Nora looked away from the screen for a moment, trying to ground herself. The air in the room felt heavier, as though someone had stepped behind her and remained very still. The deeper she analyzed, the more the pattern behaved like an echo rather than a message. It repeated itself with a softness that did not feel mechanical. It felt like an afterimage of someone leaving a room. Nora tried to explain it logically. She ran tests, simulations, and stress analyses. Every tool returned the same result. The pattern was not random. It carried intention. When she overlaid the pattern with Ethan's final work logs, she discovered something even more unsettling. The curves aligned with the last movements of his cursor on the night he died. His final motions across the screen formed a sequence that matched the hidden pattern. Inside the transfer, he had not typed anything. He had not pressed any command. Yet his presence had shaped something inside the digital architecture in his last moments. Nora felt a shiver run through her spine. She realized that the transfer might not have been created by Ethan. It might have been created by the act of dying itself. The moment his body fell silent, something in the digital world responded. Nora knew this line of thinking drifted far beyond logical explanation. Yet the evidence refused to align with anything conventional. She returned to the logs again and again, seeking an error, a glitch, anything that could break the spell of the impossible. Yet each new analysis sharpened the mystery instead of softening it. The wallet acted with perfect precision, reacting at the exact millisecond of Ethan's death. The transfer pattern mirrored his fading heartbeat. The initiating signal emerged from a place that had no power to broadcast, and the structure of the data felt like a memory rather than a message. Nora closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the truth that had been circling the edges of her thoughts. The transfer had not been sent to inform anyone. It had been sent to preserve something that refused to vanish with Ethan's final breath. She leaned forward, fingers trembling slightly, and whispered a thought that startled her with its clarity. The blockade had captured a piece of him in the moment he died. Not a soul or a spirit or anything supernatural. Something quieter. Something that lived only in the space between thoughts and patterns. Something that sought not recognition but remembrance. Nora spent the next several days living inside the data as though it were a landscape she could walk through. She felt drawn to Ethan in a way that startled her, not with affection, but with recognition. His silence mirrored her own. His retreat from the world reflected a path she feared she was beginning to take. The more she learned about him, the more his final act unsettled her. Not because of what the transfer contained, but because the transfer existed at all. Digital systems were not built to respond to the ending of a life. They could not perceive last breaths or final thoughts. Yet the pattern inside the transaction felt like something shaped by a moment of departure. She traced the lines again and again until she noticed a new detail. The curvature of the data shifted slightly when viewed at different magnifications. It behaved like a shape that carried layers of meaning not visible from a single vantage point. She leaned closer to the screen, feeling the same tremor she had felt during her first encounter. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but definite. The data pulsed with a quiet rhythm that felt human. It was enough to make her sit back and press her fingertips lightly against her forehead. As the truth settled deeper into her mind, the transfer had captured something more than intention. It had captured a trace of Ethan himself. She tried to imagine what his final moments had been like, whether he felt the weight of 12 years spent drifting through the digital world, without anchoring himself in the life outside his walls, whether he sensed the unfinished threads of his existence drawing tight around him. The blockade had recorded something that did not belong to its architecture. Nora wondered if Ethan had sensed it happening, if some part of him had recognized the shift inside the silent wallet as he crossed the threshold. Between breath and stillness, she opened his old reports and studied the patterns he had once analyzed effortlessly. His skill had been remarkable. His sensitivity to nuance surpassed that of most analysts. He had noticed subtle fluctuations in network behavior that others dismissed as noise. Nora realized that he might have seen meaning in the dormant wallet long before anyone else. She whispered into the empty room as if speaking to him. "What did you see that night? What did you understand that we do not?" The room remained still, but the unanswered questions deepened the shadow that had begun to wrap itself around her thoughts. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Nora found herself replaying the transfer in slow motion, as if watching a final heartbeat captured in digital form. The curve of the data glowed softly on her monitor. She slowed the playback further until the transfer moved frame by frame. In one frozen interval she saw something she had not noticed before. A small indentation along the curve. It looked like a hesitation, a momentary pause inside the shape, the kind of pause a person makes when caught between a decision and a memory. She leaned closer, breath held, and realized that the indentation aligned perfectly with the timestamp of Ethan's final medical record. That point marked the moment his doctor had documented a long silence. After asking him whether he felt lonely, Ethan had not answered. He had stared at the table and allowed the silence to settle. Nora felt her chest tighten as she realized that the curve reflected not just the rhythm of his heart, but the shape of his life. The pattern held the architecture of his emotional world, compressed into the smallest possible space, and it had been released only when his life had ended. Nora printed the pattern on several sheets of paper and arranged them across her table. She walked around them slowly, studying the shapes from different angles. Without the glow of the screen, the lines looked even more fragile, as though they belonged not to data, but to a sketch drawn by an uncertain hand. She noticed how the curves at the beginning of the pattern were smooth and even, while those near the end grew sharper and more erratic. The divergence was not random. It looked like the progression of a mind drifting away from the steadiness it once held. Nora felt a tug of empathy. She knew what it felt like to drift quietly while pretending to be anchored. She sat on the edge of the table and allowed herself to breathe in the stillness. The room felt different, as though the presence of Ethan's final imprint had shifted the air. She whispered again, "What were you trying to leave behind?" The question echoed in her thoughts as she returned to her desk, the weight of his silent message pressing gently against her awareness. The next morning she examined the transfer from a different angle. She approached it not as a data analyst, but as someone reading a letter from a stranger who had run out of words. The more she studied the pattern, the more she saw the shape of an attempt. It did not feel complete. It felt like Ethan had tried to press something into the blockade, but lacked the strength to finish it. The beginning held clarity, but the end drifted into something weightless, almost like a fading whisper. Nora compared the edges of the pattern to earlier snapshots of the dormant wallet. She noticed that the silent address had been created during a time when many developers experimented with expressive encoding. Ethan might have been one of them. He might have built the wallet not as a financial tool, but as a vessel for something he hoped to understand. Nora felt her pulse quicken. If he had created the address 12 years earlier, then the wallet was not a coincidence in his life. It was a reflection of him, a part of him built into a structure that refused to decay. When she recalculated the metadata, she discovered another anomaly. The signal that initiated the transfer did not come from Ethan's devices alone. It reflected a dual-source pattern, as though two distinct impulses had triggered the movement simultaneously. One impulse matched the electromagnetic fluctuation of a failing heartbeat. The other matched the subtle drop in electric activity that occurs in the brain. At the moment of death, the blockade had captured both impulses and translated them into movement. Nora felt a chill move through her. She realized that the transfer was not the result of Ethan's death. It was the result of his final act of existence. His body had released two signals, and the dormant wallet had responded as though listening. Nora stared at the screen with a mix of awe and sorrow. She felt as though she had stepped into the remnants of a conversation between life and memory, one that had taken place in a language no human had learned to speak. Nora did not sleep that night. She remained at her desk long after the building lights shut off. The glow of her monitor was the only illumination in the entire floor. She stared at the transfer, feeling the quiet pull of Ethan's final imprint tugging at the edges of her own thoughts. With the dual-source discovery echoing in her mind, she opened the pattern again and enlarged the final section, where the shape thinned into a fading curve. She traced it with her fingertip across the screen, not touching the glass but hovering above it. The curve resembled the trembling outline of something trying to hold itself together. She leaned forward, noticing a subtle shift she had never seen before. The curve contained microscopic variations, slight deviations that suggested the last flickers of consciousness translated into geometry. It looked like a mind struggling to remain within a body that was letting go. The pattern did not contain words, but it read like a final attempt to say something without language. Nora felt her breath stall as she realized she was not looking at the aftermath of death. She was looking at the moment of dying itself. The blockade had become an accidental witness to a human transition. It had preserved the residue of Ethan's last intention, capturing a form of meaning that no system was designed to hold. She printed the entire transfer on large sheets and placed them across the floor. In chronological order, she walked around the shapes slowly, studying them the way an archaeologist studies symbols carved into ancient walls. Each curve felt deliberate. Each indentation felt like a choice. But there was something else. The patterns grew denser as they approached the moment of Ethan's final heartbeat. The shapes tightened into a spiral of tension, as though the data carried an emotional gravity that pulled inward. Nora stepped closer to the section marked by the exact millisecond Ethan died. She knelt beside the paper, running her eyes along the thin line that represented the final formation. And then she saw it, a second curve hidden beneath the first, fainter, almost invisible. A shadow of a pattern left behind the moment Ethan's pulse stopped. She placed the sheet against the light of her desk lamp and gasped softly. The shadowed curve formed a small arc that rose upward. It did not match the rhythm of Ethan's heart. It felt like something else, something separate from him. The dormant wallet had not simply responded to Ethan's final signals. It had added something of its own. Nora stood slowly, her pulse racing. The digital world was not supposed to express anything beyond instruction. Yet here was a shape that felt like a gesture, a response, as though the silent wallet had reached back. She spent the next hours examining the shadowed curve from every angle. The faint shape pulsed with a rhythm that did not match any biological signal. It appeared only in the final milliseconds, and when she compared its geometry to earlier fragments of the dormant address, she felt the bottom of her stomach drop. The shadowed arc matched a pattern she found deeply buried in the metadata of the wallet's creation, a pattern that looked like a fracture, a split intention encoded long before Ethan encountered the address 12 years ago. She leaned back, stunned. Someone had built the wallet with an instruction that was not designed to activate during ordinary circumstances. It had been created to respond to something rare, something irreversible. Nora stepped away from the monitor and paced slowly across the room. Her hands trembled. She tried to form a coherent explanation, but none came. The shadowed arc looked like a quiet nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, a response to Ethan's final presence. It felt not human and not mechanical, but somewhere in between. Something had been waiting inside that silent wallet, waiting for the moment Ethan's life reached its boundary. Nora collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed by a sense of collision between worlds. She continued digging into the history of the wallet's creation, searching for the identity of the person who coded it. The address was formed 12 years earlier, when experimental encoding groups sought new methods of embedding intention into blockchain structures. Many of those attempts had failed. Some were abandoned. Others were rumored to be too unstable to deploy. Nora found a series of archived discussions from those early years. Buried in the comments was a single user who consistently explored the idea of emotional encoding. They referenced the possibility of creating wallets that responded not to commands, but to states of being. The idea had been dismissed by other developers as poetic and impractical, yet the user insisted that digital architecture could hold more than instructions. It could reflect the quiet traces of a life. Nora could not find the user's real name, but she found something else, a timestamp. The user disappeared from the community forums exactly 12 years ago. On the same day the dormant wallet was created, on the same day Ethan discovered it for the first time. Nora felt a whisper of dread. The creator of the wallet had vanished into silence, and Ethan had carried the address with him for over a decade without understanding its purpose. With her heart pounding, Nora returned to the transfer and studied both curves again. The first curve carried Ethan's final presence. The second curve carried a response to that presence, a small arc, a quiet upward gesture. It felt like a farewell offered from within the digital structure. Nora felt an ache inside her chest she could not ignore. She realized the wallet had been designed not as a vessel for currency, but as a vessel for connection, a bridge between two forms of existence. The creator of the address had woven their own longing into the architecture of the wallet. Ethan, without knowing, had been the only person attuned enough to sense the weight of its silence, and in his final moment, the wallet had reached out to him. Nora pressed her hand gently against the surface of her desk and allowed herself to feel the magnitude of that truth. The transfer was not a message. It was a response to a life, a response offered at the final moment when the boundary between presence and absence becomes thin enough to touch. Nora sat in silence long after the realization settled over her. The hum of the computer filled the room with a low vibration that felt strangely alive. She stared at the dual curves on the screen, unable to decide whether she was witnessing something extraordinary or something deeply tragic. The transfer represented more than a final moment. It represented a meeting, two impulses rising into the same breath of digital space, one born from a life ending, the other from a creation waiting. The wallet had been crafted with a sensitivity that bent logic. It had listened for 12 silent years. It had waited for someone who resonated with the intention its creator left behind. Ethan was the one who had unknowingly carried it into the final moment. Nora pressed her fingertips against her temples and tried to steady the rush of emotions filling her. She wondered if Ethan had sensed something in the dormant wallet long before his last breath. Perhaps he had felt the faint pull of a structure, designed to respond to the quiet moments of a human life. Perhaps he had lived with the shadow of it without ever understanding what it was. She reopened Ethan's earliest notes on the dormant wallet. The handwriting in his digital files grew smaller over the years, as though he had retreated into himself even as his technical skill sharpened. In the first entry he had marked the wallet with a single line. Interesting silence. Nora repeated the phrase softly. It felt like a confession disguised as observation. Ethan had always been drawn to things that did not speak. He surrounded himself with quiet. He sought out patterns that others overlooked, and he had found the silent wallet at the exact moment the developer who created it vanished. From the digital world, Nora felt her pulse rise. It was as though two lives moving through separate worlds had brushed against the same invisible thread, and the wallet had been the small point of contact that connected them. She wondered what the creator had hoped for when embedding a listening pattern into the address, whether they imagined someone would one day encounter it and understand its quiet longing. Nora continued studying the shadowed arc, tracing it across her screen with a sense of reverence. The curve had not been created by Ethan. It had been created by something that recognized his departure. The dormant wallet had responded not to code, but to the moment a human life crossed its final threshold. It was as if the digital address carried a memory of its creator's own longing, and answered Ethan in the only way it could. Nora leaned back and exhaled slowly. The truth was difficult to accept, not because it broke the rules of technology, but because it revealed something hidden inside those rules. A digital structure had been built by someone who understood loneliness deeply enough to encode a response into the quietest part of the blockade. The wallet had waited 12 years to use that instruction. It had responded only when Ethan reached a moment of profound stillness. Nora felt her throat tighten. She understood the loneliness that had shaped both men, the creator who vanished from the world, and Ethan who lived inside it without feeling part of it. She returned to the research with renewed determination. She searched through old archives, reading through abandoned threads from early blockade developers. She found fragments of philosophical discussions about the nature of digital permanence. Some questioned whether a network built on immutable records could preserve more than numbers. Others entertained the idea that intention could be encoded into the smallest structures of the chain. Nora found herself drawn to a particular set of messages written by an anonymous user. The language carried a gentleness that contrasted with the technical rigidity of the other participants. The user spoke about the desire to leave something behind that was neither information nor instruction, but a trace of a self that feared disappearing. The messages stopped abruptly, and shortly after, the silent wallet appeared in the public ledger. Nora felt a chill roll through her. She sensed the emotional fingerprint of that unknown developer inside the shadowed curve, as though the final breath of their presence had been placed inside the architecture of the address. Nora began mapping the entire sequence of the dormant wallet, from its creation to the night Ethan died. She marked every subtle deviation in the metadata, every tiny shift, every faint change in weight. When she connected the points, a path began to emerge. It was not a linear path. It curved like a winding memory. It resembled the progression of a life that had been fading before anyone noticed. The pattern felt like grief transformed into geometry. Nora's pulse quickened as she realized something profound. The dormant wallet had not awakened at random. It had awakened because it recognized resonance. The shape of Ethan's life had aligned with the intention buried inside the address. To people who never met had carried the same quiet longing, and the blockade had become the meeting place neither of them could reach in life. Nora placed her hands on the edge of the desk and lowered her head, overwhelmed by the weight of this truth. As she looked up again, she felt the atmosphere shift around her. The transfer displayed on the screen no longer felt like data. It felt like presence, not a spirit, not a consciousness, something quieter, something shaped by the last traces of emotion that survived the moment a life ends. Nora sensed that she had stepped into the remnants of a conversation between two people who never spoke, a developer who built a structure that listened, and a man who lived in silence until his final moment left a mark strong enough for the structure to answer. She felt as though she had intruded on something sacred, something meant to remain unnoticed by the world. Yet she also felt responsible. The message had surfaced in her hands. The curve had reached her screen. The story had found her. She wondered what she was meant to do with it, whether she was supposed to preserve it or release it, whether she was meant to carry the weight of two strangers who had placed their final imprints inside a digital ocean that never forgets. Nora arrived at the office before sunrise, carrying the weight of the previous night like a second shadow. The building felt hollow at that hour. Empty halls, silent rooms, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel amplified. She walked straight to her workstation and opened the transfer again. The curves glowed softly on her monitor, pulsing with a faint rhythm that felt almost alive. She placed her hand gently on the desk and inhaled deeply. Ethan's final imprint rested inside that pattern, and the creator's quiet response lingered beneath it. Two arcs bending toward one another across a boundary that could not be crossed in life. Nora felt a pull inside her chest, a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. She sensed that the transfer held something unfinished, a meeting that had happened too late, a message that arrived only when the one who needed to hear it was already gone. She studied the shadowed curve again, memorizing its gentle rise. It felt like a gesture of comfort offered in the last possible moment, a message shaped from the silence of two different lives. Nora realized she had been entrusted with the final echo of a connection that never had the chance to exist. She spent the morning cross-referencing the dormant wallet with other experimental addresses. From the same era, none carried structures similar to the dual curve. None reacted to external impulses. None contained the quiet presence woven into Ethan's transfer. She understood then that the silent wallet had been unique, not a test, not a prototype, a single creation built with intention so personal it was never meant to be replicated. She felt compassion for the unknown developer who had poured part of themselves into its design. They had built a vessel for a kind of communication that the world had no name for, something that lived between emotion and code, something subtle enough to survive silence. Nora wondered if they had disappeared because they feared no one would understand what they had created, or because the act of building it had exhausted the last pieces of themselves they had left to give. The more she studied the metadata, the more she sensed the creator had been someone who lived with the same quiet heaviness Ethan had carried. The wallet had been their attempt to place meaning into a space that did not allow decay. As the day stretched on, Nora found herself contemplating the nature of the imprint the wallet had captured. Ethan's final moment had been translated into curves that felt almost like memory. The creator's silent response had been woven into the final arc. The blockade had preserved something neither physical nor conscious, something softer, something shaped by the last fragments of intention that survived the body. Nora leaned back and stared at the ceiling. She wondered how many moments in life go unrecorded, how many thoughts vanish before they can take shape, how many quiet attempts to reach another human being are lost before they are seen. She realized that Ethan had lived a life full of unspoken thoughts and unfinished connections. Yet in the final moment, something responded to him. Something recognized him. Something reached back. The idea filled her with a feeling she struggled to name. It was not hope, not comfort, not fear. It was a sense of witnessing something rare, a truth hidden beneath the noise of the world. That evening she returned home with the printed sheets of the transfer tucked carefully in her bag. She placed them on her living room floor and sat cross-legged before them. The curves formed a quiet map, stretching across the hardwood like the outline of two lives barely touching. Nora traced the lines with her eyes, noticing how the spaces between the curves held just as much meaning as the curves themselves. She realized that silence was not the absence of communication. Silence was a form of connection that survived even when words failed. Ethan had lived inside that silence. The creator had encoded something into it, and the blockade had preserved their meeting in a way no human could have orchestrated. Nora felt a slow warmth rise inside her. She understood that the transfer was not a mystery to be solved. It was a story to be witnessed, a final moment shared between strangers who never knew they carried the same quiet ache. As she stood and looked down at the curves one last time, she felt a subtle shift inside herself. The story had changed her. It had reminded her that the digital world was not built simply from code and structure. It carried the traces of the people who touched it, their fears, their hopes, their quiet attempts to leave something behind. Nora folded the printed sheets and placed them gently inside a drawer. She whispered into the stillness of her apartment, not expecting an answer. "Thank you." It was not a message to Ethan or to the unknown developer. It was a message to the moment itself, to the connection that had formed in the thin space between departure and remembrance. She knew she would never forget what she had seen. A piece of Ethan's final presence, preserved in a shape of quiet longing. A response from someone who had vanished long before him. A meeting that happened not in life but in the breath of a moment, when time narrowed into a single line. Nora sat at her desk later that night and opened a new file. She began writing everything she had discovered, not for publication, not for recognition, but to ensure the story would not disappear into digital silence. She wrote about Ethan's life, about the dormant wallet, about the dual curves, about the quiet connection preserved inside the blockade. And when she finished, she added one final thought. Some stories are not meant to explain the world. Some stories are meant to remind us that even in silence, something listens, something remembers, something reaches back in the final moment when a human life fades into stillness. She closed her laptop and allowed the quiet to settle around her. It no longer felt heavy. It felt meaningful. She understood that silence was not an emptiness. Silence was a space where truth reveals itself. Nora stood slowly, feeling the last threads of the story settle over her with a kind of gentle finality. She walked to her window and looked out at the city lights below. Each small glow felt like a pulse inside a vast network of lives, moving through their own quiet moments. She wondered how many carried imprints that would never be seen. How many final thoughts vanished before they could be heard. How many silent connections formed in the thin space between departure and memory. She allowed herself a small smile, touched by the quiet truth she had uncovered. Ethan's last moment had not been lost. It had been answered, and the answer had been preserved in the one place designed to hold what the world forgets. She whispered into the stillness, "Goodbye, Ethan." The words dissolved into the air. She turned from the window and walked slowly toward the center of the room. Her final reflection rose inside her like a steady flame. The stories we leave behind do not vanish. They remain in the quiet places, in the patterns we create, in the traces of ourselves we never realize we are leaving. And when the moment comes for us to disappear, something in the world may reach back in its own quiet way. She returned to her desk one last time and recorded the closing thought. She knew the world needed to hear. In the vast space of digital memory, nothing truly disappears. Meaning survives in the smallest patterns. Connection survives in the quietest signals. And sometimes the final moment of a human life becomes the beginning of a truth that changes the way we see everything. Nora closed her eyes and let the thought settle fully. When you walk through silence, listen closely. Something may be speaking back. She reopened her eyes and whispered gently, "If this story reached you, let it stay. Let it remind you to look for the traces left behind in the quiet moments of your own life. And let it guide you to stories that reveal what hides beneath the surface of the world." Then she added the final message for anyone who would one day hear the story. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe to our channel and like this video. Turn on the notifications bell to be alerted about our posts. Until the next video.